Hi again, folks. Nick here with Creation Army TV. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. I've got new tutorials coming all the time. And I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, so please follow. So let's talk about envelope distortion. I mentioned this in a couple of my other videos, and for those who aren't familiar with it, let's talk about the basics of how envelope distortion works. And I have written here versus warp distortion. Now, I don't mean to say that warp distortion is bad, but I just want to show you the advantages, or basically how envelope distortion works differently from warp distortion, and how you can use it in your workflow. So let's talk about what warps are first. Warps are simple distortions that are built into every version of Illustrator. So if I write the word tigers, and of course I gave it an orange stroke and a blue stroke, you can arc your letters so that they are just sort of arced upwards like this. Very simple, very built-in effect, and to do that you just hit effect, warp, and then arc or arch or whatever, and you'll look at all of these. You'll come up with this menu that shows you little diagrams, little examples of every one of the warp styles. You can warp them horizontally, vertically. You can control the bend amount here. Some basic horizontal and vertical distortion controls are located here, and of course you want to click preview to make sure you see everything. So these are some of the most basic warp distortions, and these are great. If you need a quick distortion, like flag or something like that, it's great to be able to go up to the menu and quickly warp something the way you want it warped. However, there are times when you'll make a piece of artwork, whether it says tigers or whether it's a complex piece of artwork like a soccer field, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Sometimes warp distortion doesn't offer you the flexibility that you need to warp your artwork in a very particular way. So what do I mean by that? Let's talk about envelope basics. So an envelope distort or envelope distortion is going to allow you to make very custom distortions, very tightly controlled distortions, however you want. Let's talk about the basics of envelope distortion. I'll go ahead and delete this and I'll remake it. So what is an envelope distort? Well, when I'm teaching people Illustrator, I like to make the analogy that an envelope distort is literally an envelope. You make your artwork, whether it's just one word or a group of objects, and imagine you drawing that on a piece of paper, and you take that piece of paper and you put it inside an envelope as if you're going to mail it to somebody. So once it's inside that envelope, imagine you have that envelope in your hands and you're twisting and turning, and maybe you'll bend it, you'll turn it upside down. And the contents of that envelope, which is your hand drawing, will follow the shape of the distortion that you are doing on the envelope that it is its container. The same principle applies in envelope distortion in Illustrator. Here's an example. I'll make a bunch of squares that are white. And let's say I just make a bunch of them in a row and a bunch of them down here. So this is my artwork. You don't have to group it together. You don't have to give them a custom appearance quite yet. But you've made your artwork, right? And you want to distort this in a very custom way, a very kind of maybe achieve a psychedelic effect, something that you can't pull off with warp distortion. To do that, select all of your artwork and then go up to Object, come down to Envelope Distort. It's right below Blend. And you'll see a few options. You can make with warp, which we don't want to do. We just did that. We want to make it with a mesh. And what does that mean, make it with a mesh? We'll get to some of the other stuff later. Make it with a mesh. Go ahead and click that, and you'll see this panel pop up. So these are the mesh options. We're not going to see any change until you click preview. So what's happening here is you can control how many rows and columns exist in your mesh. So that's kind of a confusing way of saying how many control points do you want on this envelope distortion. I usually like to stick to one by one because it's simple, but here's what happens when you first see envelope mesh, this panel pop up, it'll actually be on 4x4. I don't know why the default is 4x4, because it's extremely complex. You can see here when I increase the number of rows, you can see all these lines and dots being added. These are control points. And so rows run horizontally and columns, of course, run vertically. So if I had it, let's say at 3x3, I'll hit OK. And I zoom in a couple of times. So these red dots here are now control points, and these smaller red dots are tangents. Just like you're controlling a pen tool tangent, you can control these, and you'll actually distort the inner sort of appearance of the object. You can pull any one of these in any direction you want to, and now you are creating this sort of custom distortion mesh that the contents of this distortion mesh sort of obey the shape or the contours of the mesh. With some, you'll notice some over here on the right side, it's not quite obeying this distortion mesh, and I'll show you how to fix that in a second. But just be aware that each one of these control points has tangents that you can manipulate in any direction you want, and they do have influence over the contents. In other words, I'll pull this tangent to the left heavily, and you'll see that the contents of the envelope are pulled to the left by that tangent. If I push everything to the left, then everything is distorted to the left. So keep an eye on that. Now, like I mentioned a minute ago, this is a very complex mesh. This is a 3x3. I like to, if I were doing a psychedelic effect and I needed this, then yeah, I would make a 3x3 mesh. But usually I like to stick to something basic, and it's easier to control, and I want to do a 1x1. So I could hit undo 50 times and basically undo all of the change that I made here. But there's an easier way. You don't have to do that. You can go right back up to Object, Envelope Distort, and that's where some of these other options come in. If you hit Reset with Mesh, you'll see no change whatsoever here. But you'll see this extra checkbox has been added to the Envelope Mesh panel. And it's asking you, do you want to maintain the envelope shape, which is this distortion? And no, I don't. I want to uncheck that. And of course, I'm going to reduce my mesh to 1x1. And if I hit preview, you'll see a preview of it. So now I have a 1x1 mesh, meaning the whole thing is one row and one column. And my only control points are here in the four corners. I'll hit OK. And this is my new envelope, where the control points are here in the corners. Again, these are the tangents right here that control the distortion of the mesh. If I pull this to the right, the mesh gets influenced to the right. You can take two control points at once, and you can rotate them. Let's hit R for rotate, and I'll rotate it around like that. So you're distorting this in a very custom controlled way now. And this is something that you cannot achieve using warp distortion alone. Some other great things about envelope distortion is that you can edit the contents of the envelope. In other words, you've got that envelope in your hand with your hand drawing in it, and you've twisted the envelope all around, but you realized that you forgot to write something on your drawing. So you just open up your envelope, you take out your piece of paper, you write something, you sign it, whatever, and then you put it right back in the envelope and redistort your artwork. You don't have to do a lot of work to achieve your complex mesh again. You can just add artwork to your mesh. Here's how you do it. You'll need to use your layers palette. For those of you not familiar with your layers palette, I'll be doing a video in the near future about how to control things precisely with the layers palette. But if you fold down this triangle, you'll see envelope, and that's what this object is right here. It's just defined as envelope with, if you see in the appearance palette, with contents. Okay, and I want to add something in here. I want to maybe put my name. How do I do that? You need to select the envelope. You'll go up to Object, Envelope Distort, and then you'll go down to Edit Contents. So when you hit Edit Contents, it actually looks the same. However, this grid pops up. What is this? Well, in wireframe, you can see that it's your original objects. And if you pop down this other white triangle that is now popped up here, you can actually see a list of the contents, and it's just right now it just says rectangle, rectangle, 20 times. But if you go ahead and let's pull out the text tool, and I'll just write my name. So this is independent of the envelope right now, right? How do I put this in the envelope? You need to use your layer palette, and you need to drag this text object down into the envelope. So I'll just do that, and you'll see a heavy change. And what's going on here in wireframe is it still considers the word Nick to be way up here. So my distortion looks very different, even though the envelope is not different. I'll just move this down with direct select so that it's closer to my artwork. There we go. And now Nick is here. This is the envelope, in wireframe view. This is where it lives. And you can make it larger. You can change the color. You can change the font. You can write more stuff. You can duplicate it, using I'm dragging and I'm holding Option. So you can, add more text objects if you need to, and they live inside of this envelope. And when you're done, you can leave it as is, or you can go back up to Object, Envelope Distort, and you can edit envelope instead. It would be the same option. It's down here at the bottom of the panel, and you'll just be editing your envelope again. And then you'll notice that your control points return now, and in wireframe it looks like this. Your contents are hidden. They're still in there, and they're still editable, but you have to hit Edit Contents in order to see them in wireframe. So I will just undo that. Okay. So you can see now the flexibility, no pun intended, of envelope distortion and its power. And then of course in one of my last videos about grouped appearance, you'll remember that if you take your entire envelope and let's say add a stroke below everything, make it blue, it's up to you what you want to do, but now you can add an appearance to this entire envelope as if it was a group. Let's maybe give it a drop shadow in blue, something like that. So now our entire envelope has an appearance, and the contents are unchanged. Only the appearance of the entire envelope, this blue stroke and drop shadow, appear after or below the contents. So that's kind of a walkthrough or a rundown of how envelope distortions are made. There's one other thing I want to talk about in the options for envelopes. If this is a very simple example of just a few objects, but if they had gradients, or if I had patterns, let's say I'll edit the contents, and I will take everything except the two words Nick, and I'll apply a pattern fill instead of a white fill. So let's just find a very simple line pattern. And you can do this at home too. These patterns come with Illustrator. I apologize, this is very small. Let's do large thumbnail. If I look for a diagonal line pattern and apply that, in addition to a white fill, let's put the white fill below the diagonal lines. Okay, now we can see diagonal lines. Thanks for bearing with me through that. Let me get rid of the two words Nick. We don't need those. What we're looking at now is we're looking at this pattern, and the pattern is the same it's basically always pointing off in the same angle regardless of what I do with the envelope. Notice how the line just continues on through. And that might be a look that you want to achieve. You might want a crosshatch look that is unaffected by the envelope. But you can tell Illustrator that you want the envelope to distort any patterns or gradients or anything else that exist inside of the envelope. And to do that, you would come up to Object, Envelope Distort, Envelope Options. Once you click Options, you'll see this panel pop up. You can click Anti-Alias. You can preserve the shape using Clipping Mask or Transparency. I've never really seen much of a difference with these, but what's important here is fidelity. I like to crank this up to 100 so that any shapes or distortions that go outside of the envelope or that don't follow the envelope exactly, once you crank this up to 100, then it eats a little bit more of your computer's RAM, but the contents of your envelope will conform exactly to the envelope. You can also distort appearance, which means any appearance that you make with the appearance palette or graphic styles can be distorted, or you can distort linear gradient fills and pattern fills. And once I check that and preview, you'll see that the pattern is now distorted along the lines of the envelope, and you can see it starts to maybe look like wood grain or something now. But there is a huge difference now between this, and this might be something that you want to achieve, or something that your client might want. Maybe you are making wood grain. This is a great way to achieve it. So I'll hit OK, and I like to keep my envelope options cranked up high like that, because I carefully control and make my artwork. I place it in an envelope, and I distort my envelope, and I want my artwork to follow suit. So that is how you build an envelope, and those are the options regarding the envelope. That's how you add artwork to an envelope. That's how you delete artwork from an envelope, and later that is how you can apply a custom appearance to the envelope as a whole. So using Envelope Distort carefully allows you, going back to this tiger example, allows you to make the word tigers just in white, and then you can distort it however you want, and you can carefully control how you want your items inside to look by just controlling these control points. So it takes a little bit of finesse, a little bit of patience, but it's a great way to make custom distortions on artwork. As a last example, I'll get to the soccer field that I mentioned before. This was something that I had to do in a previous freelance project. We had a soccer scene for an animation, and there were 4 virtual cameras in the scene, and the script called for 4 different points of view. That's what I mean by virtual cameras. In the first part of the scene, we needed sort of a bird's eye view of the soccer field, not unlike what we're looking at now. In the second part of the scene, the camera needed to be looking directly at the characters as if we were standing on the soccer field. In the next scene, the point of view was from behind one of the soccer players, so it was facing in a different direction. And every time we could see the soccer field in the illustration. And I always basically used the same piece of artwork. I composed a soccer field as if from God's point of view, straight down. And then I just went up to my object menu, Envelope Distort, and I used Make with Mesh. And again, I like to make a 1x1 to keep things simple. And there's my mesh, just in the corners. I'll hit OK. And what I had to do, for instance, on the second view where we had to see the player as if the camera was only maybe 5 feet off the ground, I took my soccer field and I just went ahead and just rotated everything. I rotated this part of the soccer field was far away from us. So I'll take these 2 control points and I used the transform and I shrunk them down. And so this was part of a soccer field that was now far away from us. And this part of the soccer field I made much larger using a custom sizing, and sort of did this sort of thing. The soccer field also, since this was a cartoony illustration, soccer field had a bit of a rounded top, as if the soccer field was on an exaggerated hill. And you can just distort this to your heart's content until you achieve the look that you want. Now I'm of course not getting it just yet, but maybe I'll shear these 2 control. What I did just now is I chose this left control point and this one here at the bottom, and I'll shear them based on maybe a control point right here. I'll just shear them this way. And so now we are getting a little bit closer. Imagine our soccer player right here standing about to hit a penalty kick. So, and of course you can just make it large, and since it's a vector, it scales up nicely. So I make it huge like this, and some of the soccer field was, out of view, so it just went off of the artboard. And some of the, the rest of the soccer field, in other words, the other goal, the opponent's goal, was way over here on the right side, and it wasn't visible in the scene. But the soccer player was standing right here. The high school was over here to the left. and the stands in the crowd were along the horizon line here. So Envelope Distort is an awesome way to make a flat piece of artwork conform to lines of perspective or curvature or things like that. And you can always go back in very easily and edit them. For example, the lines on the soccer field are now super thin. So if you edit contents and you just my contents now live down here. It's important to know that when you move the envelope around, you'll be moving the contents too. So if you go down to here and you choose the lines of the soccer field themselves, let's go hit Control Y again, or Command Y. Instead of a 1-point line, I want them to be a lot thicker. I want them to be maybe like 10 points or something like that. And so you can carefully control the items within your envelope at any time and maintain your nice distortion here that you work so hard to get. So that's it for basic envelope distortion. This is something that I do all the time. I do warps all the time too, but sometimes in complex illustrations I need envelopes. So open up Illustrator, experiment with this, and teach yourself, learn the basics of making envelopes and get comfortable with it. Add it to your repertoire. I'm Nick. Once again, thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook. This has been Nick with Creation Army TV. Take care.